Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to episode 206 of the podcast for August 14th, 2014. My guest today is Ed Pound. He's the co-author of the book Factory Physics for Managers that was released in April. It is, of course, a new version of the original factory physics textbook that's really well known in operations management and industrial engineering classes. It's a book I used in college, 20 years ago. And that book was the subject of podcast number 25 with one of the co-authors of that textbook, Professor Mark Spearman. So you can go to leanblog.org/25 if you perhaps want to listen to that podcast first. Ed is the Chief Operations Officer of Factory Physics, Inc., a company that was started by Spearman. And in this podcast, we're going to talk about a number of things, including the origins of the term factory physics and what it means, and some stuff that might sound kind of wonky. It's relationships between capacity, throughput, inventory, variability. That might sound dry, but this is really important stuff. It's very foundational. It's been very important to me and my career. And this new book, Factory Physics for Managers, is meant to be a more accessible book for leaders and people working out in industry or in healthcare compared to a textbook. So there's a lot of good stuff here. I hope you enjoy the podcast. And as always, you can go to leancast.org for all episodes and information about how to subscribe and get notified about new episodes as they come out. Ed, hey, thanks for being a guest on the podcast today.
Morning, Mark. Glad to catch up.
So can you start off introducing yourself and some of your background and also talk about your role at Factory Physics, Inc. for the listeners?
Sure. I spent my entire career in manufacturing. My educational background actually is in mechanical engineering, and my first job was out of college was as a manufacturing engineer. I worked a couple of years in Japan. And make a long story short, have worked in industry, both at the corporate 500 level, the Fortune 500 level with JVC and Allied Signal, which is now Honeywell, and then a number of small entrepreneurial ventures. And what I'm doing at Factory Physics, essentially my formal title is COO, and but that includes a lot. I do a lot of client interface, delivery of services, and just general marketing and speaking and trying to spread the word about the operations science of factory physics.
Yeah. I'm curious, with your time in Japan, a lot of people who worked in Japan got exposed to Lean and the Toyota production system. Was that part of your experience there?
So that's interesting. No, it wasn't. JVC makes, you're probably aware of it, makes electronics like TVs and stereo systems, that sort of thing. The one interesting part was this was 1987, 88, 89. And that was kind of before the Lean Toyota production system had really hit it big. It was starting to hit it big in the States. And I remember I used to have to go to a separate plant from the one in Mito, which is about 60 miles northeast of Tokyo. And every morning I would have to write my mokuteki, which is purpose in Japanese. And I asked them the first day, what do I write? Because I'm going down there to do manufacturing, production, engineering type work. And they said, just write Kaizen. And so every day my purpose for going down to the plant was Kaizen, and that was my first exposure to Kaizen. So when I got back to the States and people were talking about Kaizen, it was interesting to see that that comparison.
Yeah. Well, let's talk more about factory physics. I interviewed Mark Spearman a couple years ago. Gosh, I'm going to have to look this up. It was like 5 or 6 years ago. Yep. Mark was a professor of mine in industrial engineering when I was an undergrad at Northwestern. So it was right about 20 years ago now that I was taking his class, and it was actually a pre-publication copy shop version of what became the factory physics textbook, which I know a lot of listeners have probably used. And hopefully it's well worn and well read. I interviewed Mark 7 years ago, back in episode 25, and I'll post a link to that in the show notes. But tell the listeners maybe who don't know the book at all, at a real high level, what is factory physics and some of the background behind that phrase.
Sure. So Mark Spearman and Wally Hopp, who are the co-authors of the textbook Factory Physics, were both undergraduates in physics. And as Mark always likes to say, they figured out it would be better to eat than do physics because there wasn't a whole lot of work in physics. And so they both ended up serendipitously at Northwestern University, both of them with PhDs in industrial engineering. And I was actually just talking about this with Mark a few days ago. And he's like, I got there, I didn't even know Wally for a year, but once they got together, started talking, they found they had this mutual interest in physics, and they did this survey of what's going on in industrial engineering, and their conclusion was where's the science? They didn't really see a science like physics is a basic science that explains how the universe works. And so they kind of looked around and said, we're trying to understand these relationships between capacity and inventory and time and variability. And the state of the field was either on one end to do, OR and operations research is the highly technical, highly academic end of the spectrum. And but typically what happens with that is if you're going to use the OR research, you have to hire somebody who's got a PhD in OR or has studied it a lot. And then, for an executive, whether or not they actually are going to take the time to understand the math is probably not an option, but they're going to essentially just work on the credibility of the person who they hire. And at the opposite end of the spectrum is particularly in the last 30 years or so, technology's come along and people want to do a simulation of everything. Well, that has its own set of pitfalls. And they kind of said, no, and looking at the science, in other words, observing nature and operations and how do operations behave, what are those relationships? And an example of that is, when Isaac Newton said an object will either remain at rest or continue moving in a straight line unless acted upon by some outside force, there's no math, there's no software there. He just made an observation about nature and it's withstood the test of time. And some people today would say, oh, that's so simple. Anybody knows that. But they didn't know it at that time. Right. And so when Mark and Wally looked at it, essentially they came up with this idea that there are these fundamental relationships between inventory and time and capacity and variability. And the idea with factory physics, what's now called factory physics, was to help people understand that intuitively in a way that doesn't require them to get a PhD, that they can take the concepts, apply them, the next day after they've kind of gone through the overview training and put them to work. And the name actually came from I think a training session they had with Motorola maybe in the late 80s. And they were explaining these concepts and this approach as they were kind of figuring it out themselves. And a guy kind of raised his hand and goes, oh, this is like physics of the factory. And so the name stuck. Although, as you point out, the concepts apply very well in healthcare. We've actually done some work in healthcare, but that's kind of how it got started, and we've just stuck with it.
Yeah, and I think these laws of physics, and I think we can delve into this a little bit more, some of these relationships between inventory, WIP, cycle time. We learn these in class. I'm having a flashback now to sitting in the lecture hall and Mark talking about moving pennies around on this sheet of paper with different boxes.
Sure.
It's like this very manual simulation of flow through a system and what happens when you start stuffing the system full of too much WIP. And I was taking classes at the same time involving coding, writing code for optimization software and doing computer simulation. And the thing I always fall back on are the really simple practical lessons that were taught in that class. And obviously there's math and a lot of theory behind it, but I do sort of think of these as laws of physics, and I almost get sort of upset when I hear somebody's opinion. Oh, okay, we should aim for 98% utilization, and I think,
Yep.
okay, you're violating laws of physics.
Yeah,
Like,
well,
I get tense inside.
yes, definitely. That is the issue, because there is science where you make observations of nature and you test them, and then there's math, and math obviously helps you put together models that will be predictive about what's going to happen about these relationships. And you're right. What I see happen, a couple of things that happen with executives a lot of times. One is the siren lure of technology. People just say, oh, let's get these computer systems in and they'll just take care of everything for you. And then the other thing is they use the wrong models. And particularly one of the models that's used that drives counterproductive behavior a lot of times is the unit cost model. And the idea with the unit cost model is that, the unit cost of an item is the variable cost plus the fixed cost divided by the number of units. And so you have to figure out how to do this allocation scheme to distribute that fixed cost. And so what that would say is that to get the lowest unit cost, I should make as many units as possible, so I spread out that fixed cost across the units, and that gives me a lower unit cost. And that's one of the downfalls. I mean, that's a great model for allocating revenues to expenses, and this is another important point, because a lot of times if you have that discussion with accountants or finance folks, they think you're trying to tell them, oh no, you can't use that, you're doing it all wrong. No, you're not doing it all wrong. That's a great model for allocating revenues to expenses. The problem is it's not a good model for understanding the behavior of operations. And as you pointed out, when you get to very high levels of utilization of your resources, things get out of control very quickly. And so on the one hand, you get, this idea is, oh, just get software and I can start the program and I can turn my brain off, and then or the other thing you get is software. Is nowadays people will say, oh, if we just had more real-time data and we did faster and faster looks at that data, it would get us better control. That's like saying if we could just predict the future, we could make millions of dollars in the stock market and then not have to work. And so you've got, on one hand, people using the wrong models for what they're trying to accomplish, and then the other hand, this idea that, oh, if they just have enough technology, you can control anything perfectly, and it's a dangerous combination.
Yeah, and probably not unique, but maybe rare in my work with hospitals of ending up very often grabbing an easel pad or a whiteboard and sketching out Little's Law and starting to draw these curves, because that siren song of keeping everybody busy or keeping everything busy, it just sounds so good. And you're right, cost measurements may drive that, whether it's in a factory or in a hospital. Manufacturing people would say, well, we're gonna start more production, we're gonna add more WIP, because that'll allow us to spread out our costs and it'll look like we have a lower unit cost. But whether it's factory physics or the Toyota production system and Taiichi Ohno, there's so many great lessons about the need to focus on flow and not just focus on unit cost. I think it was Ohno who said, factory managers tend to get more upset about seeing idle people or idle machines than they are about idle product, coming through the factory.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Ohno. After, unfortunately, it was right after we wrote the most recent book, Factory Physics for Managers, I ran across this article where I think it was Ellie Goldratt and a guy named Fox, who I think worked with Goldratt, actually interviewed Ohno. And they said, what is the science behind the Toyota production system? And interestingly, Ohno's answer was, well, I don't know. I've actually hired economists to come in and tell me the science behind it, but I don't really know what the science is. And they'd say, well, I don't understand. How does that work if you've been so successful? He said, all I was trying to do was to make products flow like a river. So that was his concept that he was working on. And so the issue with that is, because there wasn't a fundamental scientific model underlying that. What you see nowadays is people taking the concepts and trying to apply them in practice to the extremes without understanding all the consequences of doing that. And it's important to understand those underlying relationships, or else you can drive yourself over a cliff.
Yeah, and if people are relying too much on something that sounds like dogma, I've seen companies hurt themselves by saying, "Oh, okay, the key is low inventory, so we're going to get rid of all of our finished goods inventory."
Right.
And when I did a grad school internship at a company, they had really hurt themselves because now they weren't making their shipment schedule to their customers because they had a long lead time process with lots of variation in quality and lead time. And in hindsight, they realized it was just the dumbest thing ever to follow this dogma of, well, we're going to ship just in time. They weren't capable of that.
Yeah, it's not understanding your capabilities, not understanding the underlying behavior, which probably is a good time to kind of do a quick summary, of the science. So the science of factory physics says that, any value stream, any process, any supply chain is made up of demand and transformation. And if I have zero variability, I can perfectly synchronize demand and transformation, or demand and supply. As soon as I make something, somebody shows up and says, "That's exactly what I wanted. How did you know?" And they give you their money and they walk away happy. And then you switch over and make something you never made before. Yeah. And then the same thing happens again. And then your processes always work perfectly. Machines never go down. Setups are instantaneous. People always show up. It's a wonderful world to live in. And when I describe this to executives and managers, people kind of start either smiling or looking at me like I have two heads or something. Yeah. But we don't live in that world because physics says there's variability. And when you have variability and you're trying to synchronize demand and transformation, you end up with buffers. And that's why we talk about the science. This is the natural behavior of operations. You will have buffers. It's not something that's like, oh, I read in the Harvard Business Review about this new concept called buffers. We ought to look at getting some. You will have buffers. And so the idea is there's only three buffers. There's inventory, time, and capacity. Yeah. So for an executive, what executives need to do is understand the relationships between these. And again, you don't need a PhD. There's about three fundamental relationships that we teach. Once you understand those relationships, your job is to pick the best portfolio of buffers. You might have some inventory, you might have a little bit of time delay, you might have some capacity buffer that works to meet your business's marketing and financial goals. So the set of buffers and the level of variability that you choose to deal with is different from business to business. And it's not that difficult to understand. But what we see is just what you mentioned. Sometimes it's good to have more inventory. Sometimes it's good to have less inventory. Sometimes it's good to have more capacity. Sometimes less capacity. If you're in an ambulance service, you've got a lot of capacity. Ambulances sit around a lot, and there's very low utilization. But that's the business model. If you are making gasoline at a refinery, you have very expensive assets, and you keep those things running all the time. But those are that's high utilization. So that it just depends on the business. And what we see, and we talk about this in the book, the new book, is people jump back and forth, just as you described. 1 year, oh yeah, we're going to make to demand, let's cut all inventory. And then bam, customer service goes in the tank. And so now we go back to adding inventory or adding costs, and then cost is too high. And then bam, we go back over to, now we got to do something about, our response time. And so what happens is people jump back and forth. And, if you call that continuous improvement, it's basically a guarantee for lifetime improvement. Lifetime employment, because you're always jumping from one thing to the other. And our point is that if you look at the science, there are these trade-offs. You will not get rid of the trade-offs between, low inventory versus high inventory, low utilization versus high utilization. So what you need to do is, as a manager, understand those relationships and pick the ones that work best for you. And then you're predictive about it. You're not always reacting. That jumping back and forth, you can call that continuous improvement. We would call that what we call whack-a-mole management. You ever seen the whack-a-mole game? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That pendulum swings back and forth way too far to too many extremes, right?
Absolutely. And I've seen people who say, yeah, you're right. We did Kaizens last year, and then now we're doing them this year, and they work completely against what we did last year. And So the idea is there is a method, there is a science to help people understand this. It's not overly complex, and it really helps managers. What you're trying to get to is managers to have good intuition. In other words, the models that they're using are the right models that keep them from making stupid decisions ahead of time, like the idea of, oh, yeah, let's just cut our inventory. We'll build to demand.
Yeah.
You know, you have variability. You're going to have buffers.
Well, and it served me so well in my career that, yeah, I like that thinking of it as intuition that I learned from Mark Spearman. And so, I mean, let's maybe transition and talk about introducing this science. You know, how do we try to build this intuition in executives? Maybe this brings us to talk about the Factory Physics for Managers book and how that came to be and what the purpose is there.
Yeah, so the original book, Factory Physics, Mark and Wally, as you said, you know, I think, when were you at Northwestern?
I graduated in '95, so I took his class in, I believe, the fall of '94.
Okay, yeah, so I was in at Kellogg in business school in the Triple M program, which is a joint MBA between the McCormick Institute of Technology and the Kellogg Business School, and the focus was on manufacturing. And so I was there at the same time. And, you know, they had the Cliff Notes, but they were really they were kind of working their way through it, and they were writing a textbook. And Mark left Northwestern about 96, went to Georgia Tech for a while, and then he ended up starting Factory Physics, Inc. in 2001, and I joined him in 2002. But, you know, having been working through that, I think the book was first published in 1996. After, you know, however long it's been, 10, 15 years, we've had all this experience. And when you hand a manager a 700-page textbook and go, oh, yeah, all the information's right here, you know, their eyes tend to roll back in their head. And so the idea with Factory Physics for Managers was to talk about these same concepts that we've just been discussing more for managers. And it's a much shorter book. And it's a lot more focused on the concepts, a lot of visual examples to help people understand it. But the idea was to get to more of an industry approach to how to put these concepts in practice.
Mm-hmm. So, what sort of stories or examples? Or sort of, you know, kind of prime examples that executives would be interested in. I mean, they might not. What grabs their attention? I mean, it might not be the factory part or the physics part, but it's about improving their business, right?
Yeah, and I think the one thing that grabs people's attention, and you know, when we're doing presentations, we have, you know, 2 or 3 slides right up front. The one slide that grabs people's attention is this idea that there are trade-offs, and if you don't understand that, you're basically just whipsawing back and forth, and you're doing this whack-a-mole management. And so a lot of times people look up and they go, oh my gosh, that's exactly, you know, our world. So when we're talking about a science, first we talk about the environment. We're describing what the environment's like. And then the idea that there's these 3 buffers and there's variability. And actually, you know, you can choose to increase variability. You know, a lot of times you hear from Six Sigma, it's like, oh, we got to have 0 variability. Well, no, what you really want, the goal is to make the most money. And you can choose to increase variability by, for instance, adding products or services or whatever. Heck, you know, half of the Fortune 500 annual reports will say something like, we're going to lead the market by providing the most innovative products and services. Well, that's a conscious decision to increase variability. So variability is not always bad. The point is, if you increase variability, your buffering requirements are going to go up. That's just the laws of science. That's the way nature behaves. But if your revenue goes up more than cost, it's a good thing. It's a good thing, good decision for the company. So those are 2 of the fundamental ones. One of the things, a takeaway that people seems to resonate with executives and managers is this idea, particularly nowadays, you know, where you see from the Toyota production system adherence, that's the idea of one-piece flow. Oh, we got to make one-piece flow. Well, as it turns out, and we go through that in a fair amount of detail in the book, you know, too little whip is just as bad as too much whip. And really what you need is, if you have variability, you're going to have some whip to make sure you buffer that variability, or else you're going to lose throughput. And too many times, I can't tell you how many clients, prospective clients I've been to, they're like, oh yeah, we got this one piece flow and we got inventories really low, but we have problems with customer service. Well, yeah, you have problems with customer service because you're not getting enough throughput out to meet the volume of demand that you need. Although the products that you do get out, you get out very quickly. And so that's kind of interesting because a lot of that, initially people's intuition is bad about that because they'll think, oh, if I can get things out quickly, I'm going to have good customer service. But that's kind of like saying, the example we give in the book is, there's a forest fire on 1,000 acres and every person on each acre is a person with a house, right? And so if you're doing this low whip approach, essentially that's like the fireman showing up with a garden hose and saying, oh, I can be on any one of these 1,000 acres very quickly. But, it's like, well, you don't have the volume to deal with the problem because, you're not going to have enough water with a garden hose to put out a forest fire. And so that concept is another one where we try and emphasize to people that no, one piece flow can drive your throughput over a cliff. I actually worked at a client where we walked in the second day, we did one of our analyses, and second day it was obvious that was the problem. And these people, within about 2 months' time, had increased throughput 30% by putting more whip in the system. And unfortunately, they had been working on that one-piece flow concept for about 15 years. So that was a lot of lost opportunity.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I mean, we're talking here about the science of operations, and we keep running into this fight between dogma and science. I mean, the one-piece flow dogma is violated even here at the Toyota plant in San Antonio. You can't see me. I'm pointing out my window down to the south, vaguely pointing at the factory for some reason. But they have buffers at different points within their truck assembly line. So sure, in theory, it's generally single piece flow, but they do have equipment problems. They do have obviously people pull the andon cord, and if they can't fix the problem, they stop the line. So Toyota is being practical as opposed to following dogma.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point that you brought that up because that Mark actually wrote chapter 1, and he very specifically goes into the fact that Toyota has pretty significant capacity buffers, and nobody seems to realize that. The fact that just when I set the takt time on a line, if the longest task takes, I think the example we give is 25 seconds. I'm not going to set the line to run at 25 seconds because half the time, people are going to be into other stations and, people will be fighting and hitting each other with wrenches and that sort of stuff. But so what you do is you set the takt time, say at 30 seconds. Well, that's a capacity buffer. That's essentially, I think, like almost a 20% capacity buffer, maybe like 13, 15%, something like that. So that's a capacity buffer. And then if you set, which Toyota, I don't know how much they do it now, but when they first got started, they would schedule 10 hours of work in a 12-hour day because they wanted to make sure that whatever their quota was, they made it. And so that's another capacity buffer. Yeah. And so people look at Toyota and they go, oh, it's an assembly line and one piece is moving at a time. And they think, oh, that's just perfect one-piece flow. Well, actually, no, there's a lot of buffers in there. And then, like you say, if there are stations or whip accumulation points between parts of the assembly line, that's another buffer. And so, this idea that there's this perfect world with one-piece flow just really drives people over the dogma cliff. And it can be highly counterproductive.
Well, and let's not forget the significant inventory buffers in the system sitting on dealer lots. Toyota has no more figured out build-to-order car manufacturing than anyone else did. When I worked at Dell in 1999 and 2000, a lot of automakers, and I was would come and visit, and I would often help lead these tours because I had background in the auto industry, and they were all trying to figure out how to build a car and get it to a customer within 5 days. And I think they all pretty well decided that's impossible for their business because at Dell, a PC took like literally 3 minutes to assemble. Yeah. It was just, it was simpler than most any other type of manufacturing. So Dell could do that very quickly, but then they had big, huge capacity buffers, meaning half the factory was sitting empty during the parts of the quarter when sales were low. And that's a whole different that is a whole different story,
but that's an interesting comparison because we actually did some work with Dell, and that was back then. And their model was, as you described, they had this huge capacity buffer, and so around Christmas and graduation, they had all these people working all the conveyors and the assembly stations. But their dogma was no finished goods inventory, and our response to them was, well, wait a minute, I see these ads in the paper, every Sunday that I'm selling these at the time, whatever, I don't know, $900 computers. I mean, that's going out. Why wouldn't you hold some finished goods inventory? Oh, no, we can't do that. So interestingly, now what they've done is they've completely gone away from that model. And I'm not saying it doesn't make sense that whole industry has evolved, but now, they've outsourced all their manufacturing to, I think, Foxconn.
Most of it, yeah.
And they hold a ton of inventory. So it just depends
from China,
on China, or Mexico. It just depends on what the business conditions are. But you should understand, make a conscious decision about what your buffer portfolio is, rather than just saying, let's just have zero inventory or something crazy like that.
Well, one thing you cover in the book, which I've heard people say is another form of dogma, is Boeing and their moving assembly lines.
Yeah, that's essentially that. There's an example in the book about that. We just think that was the wrong production design. And actually, I talked with a director of future plane production, and he told me, he said, we know everything about aircraft design. I think the four things are like lift, thrust, drag, and I don't know, weight, or I forget what the four things are. But he goes, every time we go to make a plane, we redesign production. And so this idea where they put jet planes on a moving assembly line, the takt time for a jet plane is, like one every 3 days or something like that, just is, in our view, the perfect example of applying the wrong model to a particular business where it doesn't work as well. And again, that's another example we describe in the book. And I'm not saying they didn't get any benefits out of it, but our contention is that there would have been a lot more productive ways to get the results they got than just, shutting down the line for 2 months at the height of demand or whenever they did it to install a moving assembly line, because that's what Toyota did. And so, I think there's that's a pretty good example of just kind of following dogma rather than looking at what works best for your business.
And I have friends who work at Boeing and other people who have reached out, and they'll of course go unnamed here, but they feel like heretics because they question the
Mark, let me tell you, if you approved and you're running a $250 million project, it will by definition be a success. Okay. That's just kind of the way that works.
There's not a whole lot of room for plan, do, study, adjust. That's going to be plan, do. Yes, it worked brilliantly.
Yeah, it worked great, and let's get everybody to show them and tell them it worked great. Yeah. But anyway, Boeing's a great company. But that in that particular example, everybody make mistakes, and we think that was a mistake.
Yeah. Well, there's so much we could talk about here, but we're running a little low on time.
Sure.
One other thing I wanted to bring up, it's right on the cover of the book and in the subtitle of the book. You talk about what's called, quote unquote, a post-lean Six Sigma world.
Sure.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Because that it was intended to be a bit provocative, but the idea is not a world without Lean or Six Sigma. Those are very, very useful techniques. The idea of a post-Lean Six Sigma world is a world where you're not working on dogma, you're working on an operations science, and you apply those techniques as they're needed. And what you have now is sort of the trinity of, continuous improvement approaches. There's theory of constraints and Lean and Six Sigma, and people kind of go back and forth. Does this work or that work? And our idea is, wait a minute, let's understand the fundamental science, these relationships, and then use what works well when it works well. And so that's the idea. We are highly supportive, and we talk about this in the book. I think organizations do have to have personnel and resources dedicated to continuous improvement, especially larger ones. But we just want them to do that with a more predictive approach, a more science-based approach.
Yeah, and I would agree. That there's definitely a need for that science. Like I said, that was so foundational and so helpful to me in my career. And I think some of the other lean concepts, I mean, I don't really practice Six Sigma. That's just not my background. But it all goes hand in hand. And I think a lot of what we're taught about lean fits in very well conceptually with factory physics, and factory physics can help us explain why some of these lean practices we'll teach, and people say, well, why should we do that? Instead of saying, well, Toyota does it, we can point to the physics. And, and I think that's very helpful.
Book. And particularly for your audience, where you're mainly focused in healthcare, we actually did an engagement with a hospital in South Florida, and they were trying to, what they really wanted to do was to reduce patient flow time through the ER. And as it turned out, it's one of those laws of science. Between Thanksgiving and Easter in South Florida, demand goes through the roof. And, if the hospital is at 98% utilization in terms of beds, people are going to back up in the ER, because what happens in the ER is, you get people in, and then a lot of times they get admitted to the hospital, and you have more and more people. You literally, what they were doing was having people on gurneys in the hallways, and we just said, look, if you're not going to turn anybody away, because that was the mission of the hospital, we don't turn people away.
Or the law says you can't turn people away from the emergency room, at least.
Well, there you go. And if you're not going to, well, but you, I don't know. I'm not going to.
They go on diversion, or Anyway,
anyway, if you're going to have this demand in excess of capacity, people are going to be back up. Now, one of the things that we did find was, they were doing some things that could have decreased the utilization of the hospital. I mean, occasionally, this idea where doctors show up and do their rounds all at the same time, and people get dismissed. I forget what the right word is, but they get checked out of the hospital all basically at the same time. That's batch processing, and so that tends to increase the cycle time. So there were some things that they could have done in the hospital, but I remember standing, we're kind of doing our final report out, and we had seen that they had all these other consultants in there, and I just told the CEO, I said, one of the things I can tell you for sure is you don't need to keep hiring consultants to tell you how to reduce flow time, because as long as you are at 95, 98% utilization in the hospital, people are going to back up in the ER.
Right.
And, you can either build a new hospital, get more capacity in the hospital, but that's just the way it's going to work. And actually, they ended up building a new hospital. So it applies all over.
Yeah. Well, I would certainly encourage even, listeners who are in healthcare to pick up the book, or at least go check out the website. You've got a sample chapter that people can read and see if this piques their interest. Talk a little bit about the website, where people can find the book, how they can learn more.
Yeah, so the new books we've talked about is Factory Physics for Managers. You can get it at Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. The website is FactoryPhysics.com, and there's plenty of information up there, case studies and the like, or you can send us an email, and we'll get back to you.
Okay, well, Ed, thank you so much. Again, my guest has been Ed Pound from Factory Physics Inc., and the book is Factory Physics for Managers. Highly recommended. And Ed, I want to thank you for talking to me and the listeners today.
My pleasure. You're welcome. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.